Section 4. Aftermath. A case that I never closed. I wish I could tell you this story had a resolution, that justice was served, or that time healed what had been broken. But this story doesn't end that way. For 13 years, I existed in a world without color, a purgatory where the days are now a blur, and one day was like any other, lifeless and heavy. I wasn't living, I was drifting, an observer in my own life. It is tragic to say, but something bad was on the distant horizon. It would mark a second climax to this story. I would not be able to endure this forever. I'm getting ahead of the story. I struggled to pay bills, buy groceries, and watch as weeks turned into months, as seasons changed outside my window, while I remained unchanged, unmoved. It wasn't sadness, not exactly. It was worse. My life was characterized by emptiness. I waited. For what? I didn't know. Maybe for something to change. Maybe for someone to notice. Maybe just for a reason to believe that my life still mattered. But nothing changed. Hope was completely gone. There were moments, brief flashes, when I almost reached out. A phone call I never made. A letter I never sent. A conversation I avoided. But I always stopped myself, because if my own family didn't care, why would anyone else? And so I stayed in the shadows, counting the days, counting the years. Toxic shame is a kind of shame that speaks to one's sense of self, and it's not about anything one did. The tragic thing about this shame was it cut me off from human connection and support. The slow disintegration. The trauma didn't just leave scars, it rewired me. I lost parts of myself, the parts that had once fought to be seen, to be valued. I was not the same person who had once built a career, who had once loved and been loved, who had once believed in something beyond mere survival. I withdrew. Growing up, I had withdrawn into hiding. This was different. I believed I had to embody the false self that Anna had created with her lies. Sleep was fitful, filled with nightmares of not being believed, and the horrifying results of not being believed by those in authority, those who are supposed to protect victims. And when I woke up, it wasn't relief I felt, it was exhaustion, because another day had begun, another day of this. There were disturbing events as well. Beyond the despair and hopelessness and the remnants of trauma, there were new traumatic events. Chapter 17. Needing to find work and income. It was the middle of 2006. I was 40 years old, and in the last 2 years had been a brutal fight for survival, homeless, betrayed, falsely accused, and now forever marked as a criminal. Although my status as a homeless person was on the verge of changing, everything else remained a bleak constant. The Division of Vocational Rehabilitation, VR, had funded my certification in web design. This was before Anna's vicious attack, before I was thrown into jail, before I was cornered into accepting a plea deal. I was already crushed, having lost my career, my home, my clinical license, and so I numbly went along with a suggestion we stumbled upon together. I admit I was something of a geek, with a faint curiosity about technology, yet I had no desire to work in that field. That's why I used my engineering degree as a stepping stone to earn a graduate degree, a Master of Social Work. Web design and development felt like a tedious, soul-crushing task of writing code for a lifeless machine. I was too shattered by the harrowing weight of 7 torturous months in jail to grasp these realities then. I had moved forward like a docile child, surrendering my clinical license and following their suggestions. Now, with an indelible stain on my record, a violent crime etched into eternity, I wrestled with the grim reality that no one would ever trust me to work in a helping profession, in a role where trust is essential. The most agonizing part is that the crime I was wrongfully convicted of can never be erased or expunged. Not ever. I thought you could trust me, no matter who you were. Yet Anna had spun an entirely different tale, and the detectives bought into her fabrications completely. My life seemed split into two opposing forces, truth and reality. The truth was the essence of who I truly was and had always been. Reality, however, was a social construct woven from tales told by others. None of the stories about me were penned by anyone who genuinely knew me. Let's step back a moment. After I was released from jail, I found myself with a web design certificate, but nowhere to call home in Chapel Hill. Eric, my VR counselor from Durham, continued to support me. He was still there, alongside a job coach, trying to guide me through the tricky terrain of job applications, where every form demanded whether I had a criminal record. Each application was a harsh reminder, a trigger I never anticipated. I never thought it would end up being a consideration I'd have to face. Eric's advice seemed to imply I should acknowledge guilt while pleading for a second chance. Perhaps he meant well. Maybe he thought it was unrealistic for me to expect every employer to disregard my recent conviction. Yet I felt torn. I couldn't bring myself to follow his guidance. I couldn't do it. I had already lost so much. My freedom, my reputation, my career, my dignity. But I clung desperately to the truth. Eric's advice mirrored the beliefs of many about the justice system, where pleading guilty equates to committing a crime. However, the plea deal and my courtroom responses had been arranged without my input, as if my lawyer had made all the decisions for me. As you might recall from my earlier account of these events, it was a tangled mess, and I was caught in the middle, struggling to reconcile the truth I held on to with the reality imposed upon me. Guilt had never been made concrete and real when I seemed to plead guilty in front of the judge. I literally lacked the ability to summon up air to vocalize my truth. VR had determined previously, with my input, that a traditional job would be difficult for me. A home-based business was a plan. But what good was a home-based business when you had no home? Initially, the debate was centered on whether VR should purchase equipment for use on Holloway Street in Durham. This particular area had garnered a notorious reputation, known far and wide as a drug-infested, crime-ridden section of town. Eric, though not one to articulate every detail of what he knew about the neighborhood, was acutely aware of its infamy. He didn't need to witness the discarded needles littering the streets, or be approached by hookers desperate for their next fix. Nor did he need to experience the fear of being mugged or threatened on Holloway Street firsthand to understand its perilous nature. Given the well-known facts about Holloway Street, I always wondered why the detectives weren't more suspicious of Anna's story about being there merely to collect rent. The case might have been concluded, but I couldn't help but marvel at the detectives' apparent naivety as they listened to Anna's account. During the brief period between the plea deal and securing stable housing, I was guided by a job coach and Eric at VR to find any form of employment. However, this situation was on the brink of transformation. A chance at stability, my heart had once blazed with an unquenchable fury for social justice. That was still a part of me even as I found myself ensnared in the very existence I sought to obliterate for millions across the United States. Homelessness and poverty clawed like savage beasts that were unleashed by the indifference of my own family. And all of this was demanding immediate action. I had sought refuge at the IFC, Interfaith Council for Social Services, shelter in Chapel Hill, staying at their homeless shelter. I also participated in meetings to address homelessness. The federal government doled out block grants to the state, and communities gathered putting their heads together to try to do what they could with the limited funds from the federal government. I attended these gatherings, not as a mental health professional and clinical social worker I once was and would have been, but as a homeless individual stripped bare of the life I had meticulously planned. Since I was not the social worker I had envisioned that I would be at this time in my life, I imagined that I was limited in how much I could contribute. Hopefully my own story will help inspire others to look for solutions. It was in this time of transformation that I met Vanessa, a formidable representative from the local mental health center. She held a high-ranking position at the agency, a beacon amid the chaos. The early 2000s were a time of violent upheaval in mental health services, with agencies where I had once worked being reduced to mere administrative skeletons. The government heralded this as efficiency. The social worker within me screamed in silent agony, tormented by the countless people abandoned as society's outcasts, people society had discarded, branded as if they deserved their plight. Patients discharged from psychiatric hospitals were hurled into communities woefully unprepared to support them, with funding grotesquely inadequate to meet the surging tide of needs. I was ensnared in a maelstrom, torn between the seething passion that had driven me to earn my Master of Social Work degree and the visceral urgency to simply survive in a barren, hope-starved reality. That passion within me was well below the surface. I had been in the habit of dissociating from those things that would cause me pain, such as the realization that I might never work in my field because of the false criminal conviction. My passion for social justice, the lifelong drive to make the world a better place, this existed in an exiled and wounded part of myself. My dissociation was in the form of emotional and psychological numbing, a form of detachment. And then Vanessa did something no one else had dared. She extended a hand to help. She connected me to a housing program called Shelter Plus Care, a lifeline for those who had been homeless for at least 2 years and bore a disability diagnosis. Normally, people languished for years waiting for a Section 8 voucher. I had been on Section 8 and had almost abandoned hope of receiving a voucher. At this point in my life, 2 or 3 years felt like an eternity. I could only focus on surviving each relentless day. Vanessa's role in my life at this time felt like a strange twist of fate. On the one hand, it seemed she could see right through me, recognizing that I wasn't meant for a life on the streets. My vulnerability was obvious to her, and while she couldn't undo the unjust circumstances that had brought me here, she introduced me to a program that sounded promising, Shelter Plus Care. The name suggested I might receive not only housing, but also the treatment I desperately needed. Sure enough, just weeks after that frustrating plea deal, I found myself approved for Shelter Plus Care and a place in Carrboro, an area nearly part of Chapel Hill. Relief washed over me, knowing that at least one person in a position of influence had noticed my struggle and cared enough to help. But even with this glimmer of hope, I couldn't shake the feeling of uncertainty. I knew I needed more than a home. What hope was there when I had lost my reputation? My name was never cleared. The actual perpetrator had gotten away with everything. I was understandably scared of something going wrong, even with my housing situation. I had a job coach, as I mentioned, and his name was Harold. We rode out to see the place. I said, "I just got convicted of this crime. Do you think that is going to affect my chances of getting into this situation?" Harold said that if he was me, he would just not mention it. Don't let anything stop this from happening. I felt it was risky and scary. I was afraid to get my hopes up and then to have this taken away from me. Yet I wasn't eager to volunteer information about the lies and the false conviction. Did Vanessa know? Probably not. But then again, maybe she did. Shelter plus care seemed to offer a situation where not only was housing provided, but there was a care component, seemed to imply that the program had additional resources for one to receive treatment for one's disability, be it physical or mental illness. The care component was not actually a part of the program. The program didn't include a grant to fund treatment services. They didn't create any form of treatment or rehabilitation for the participants in the program. Maybe the original plan had that in mind, but the result was something like an expedited form of approval for Section 8 housing. So I moved into an unfurnished apartment with very little income. I was able to work at Measurement Incorporated again. I was scoring standardized tests from students in schools across the U.S. We were hired as contract employees, and for as long as the contract lasted. Often one contract leads directly to the next project without hardly any interruption. My parents were still a part of my life, despite their betrayal when I was in jail. They brought a table with a couple of chairs, along with a few other items, declared disabled by the federal government. Cornered and desperate, I found myself thrust into the grueling process of applying for Social Security Disability Insurance, SSDI, a journey that had begun even before Anna's brutal assault. The relentless trauma of repeated victimization in Durham, followed by an unjust imprisonment after being preyed upon, shattered me beyond recognition, leaving scars so profound they defied words. The torment of disbelief cut deeper than any knife, amplifying the oppressive shadow that haunted every moment of my existence. I enlisted the aid of a disability lawyer, acutely aware of the systemic cruelty where initial claims were routinely tossed aside, not out of skepticism about one's disability, but as a perverse test of stamina. Even the most glaringly evident cases were rejected, not just once, but twice, as if enduring this torment was an initiation ritual. Lawyers thrived on this vicious cycle, claiming 30% of the back pay once the case was finally approved. It was logical. They couldn't be expected to work for free, yet the entire ordeal felt like a grotesque performance. If one could withstand the excruciating waiting game after two soul-crushing denials, the case would eventually reach a judge who would finally grant approval. Unlike the evasive Section 8 vouchers, limited in number, disability approvals had no cap. But the path to that approval was a battlefield of endless struggles and waiting, a brutal testament to sheer persistence. I find myself torn, not wanting to dive into a rabbit hole or veer off topic, yet feeling compelled to address the past. Before the state held me hostage, my friends, those who initially supported me and offered me housing when I first arrived in Durham, believed I didn't deserve disability benefits. This belief was based on our understanding of what I had endured at the time. They themselves were battling for these meager government allowances despite their own harrowing experiences. Both of my roommates suffered from dissociative identity disorder, DID, which was believed to have stemmed from horrific crimes, torture, and abuse in their early years of life. My application process began in 2004, prior to the traumatic events and unjust imprisonment, and was backdated to 2003. Fast forward to July 2006, I found myself entering a courtroom alongside my disability attorney, facing a judge. I walked out, conflicted, yet knowing I had been approved. Having worked tirelessly since I was 16, by the year 2000, I was earning a six-figure salary, a stark contrast to the $30,000 salary I had when I graduated from my master's program in 1996. Perhaps my income with an MSW and some clinical training was even higher. In 2025, such roles would easily command $70,000, and private practice in North Carolina could reach $200,000, not just $100,000. The crux of my internal struggle lies in the fact that I had led a normal life, with significant earnings to show for it, up to a certain point. One might assume that someone retiring or transitioning to SSD, I could live comfortably. Yet the reality is they evaluate the entirety of a person's earnings history. Having done little work after age 34, my monthly benefits would barely keep me above the poverty line. It wasn't as dire as SSI, Social Security Insurance, which is entirely needs-based and reflects true poverty, but my monthly checks would hover just above that threshold. This reality leaves me deeply conflicted, caught between the life I once led and the limitations I now face. My disability lawyer, distinct from the criminal lawyer who had pressured me into accepting a plea deal, presented my case focusing on major depressive disorder and generalized anxiety disorder. However, this approach ignored the post-traumatic stress disorder that has defined my condition, going all the way back to 2003 or earlier and up to the present day in 2025. At the time, I was relieved to be approved, yet a nagging feeling told me something was amiss. In the interest of expediency, he omitted the most significant truth. I wasn't just depressed, I was deeply traumatized. Back then, it never crossed my mind, nor did anyone suggest that I could reopen the criminal case and challenge the plea deal. In hindsight, doing so right after the plea deal disaster would have carried far more weight. The looming specter of statutes of limitations has haunted me for nearly 2 decades. It's now 2025, and my friend Sarah still clings to the notion of justice, envisioning a new court proceeding 19 years after the plea deal in 2006. There are rational, albeit not legal, remedies to this situation. Being declared disabled as far back as 2003 should have nullified the plea deal, since there was a government-recognized reason why I couldn't have reasonably entered into it. Ironic, isn't it? The criminal lawyer I had trusted became a villain in my story due to the threats and pressure he exerted over the plea deal. In hindsight, I am torn, wondering if I should have approached my disability lawyer to see if overturning the recent plea deal was possible based on the circumstances I described. During the plea deal, the judge inquired if any mental health conditions could compromise my ability to agree. My lawyer must have signaled or somehow prepared me to deny any such conditions, despite my lack of awareness. What I said wasn't a lie, but rather a reflection of my ignorance. Yet that ignorance now leaves me questioning every decision made in those fraught moments. I would continue to question whether there was any way to overturn the plea deal. I could have called the prosecutor as a witness if any lawyer had been there on my side during this time, or if I had a family and not the illusion of a family that cared things might have been different. A real family would have cared enough to help me navigate these challenges. I had been victimized multiple times, first by Anna, then by the police, then by the courts, and finally by a world that refused to believe me. PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, would be added to my medical records later, but by then the damage was done. The federal government ruled that I was 100% disabled, 100% unable to work, 100% discarded by society. The financial payout came in, the back pay for every month and year since 2003, around $30,000, a lump sum for the years I had already suffered. That was just my share. My lawyer would have gotten about $10,000. I didn't begrudge him that payment. After that, I would receive a monthly check, which was slightly above the federal poverty level. This lump sum payment was more than I would ever see again in my life, more than even the share of the inheritance from my mother's death in the 2000s and 20s, which would help me get a car for the first time in over 2 decades. It was survival money, not a future. No amount of money could undo what had happened. A life I never imagined I possessed, not one, but 2 prestigious college degrees. That meant nothing. I had meticulously crafted a life, a thriving career, a profound purpose, only to witness it all obliterated in the blink of an eye. That meant nothing. The world, a twisted version of reality, demanded I simply accept it. Swallow it whole and let it work for me. Accept it. Abandon your hopes, dreams, and aspirations. Here's a paltry $30,000. Now deal with it. A pathetic farewell token from the U.S. This is the pinnacle of their generosity toward its citizens. It declared, here's $30,000 and here's a home, a parting gift. This is just my reconstruction of events. No apologies were offered. No acknowledgement of mistakes made. Instead, it felt as though reality, woven from deceitful narratives, painted me as a criminal, yet I was still owed something. Yes, reality, built on a foundation of lies, painted me as a violent figure when, in truth, I was as gentle as a butterfly landing softly on your arm in a serene meadow. To be clear, the disability matter did not examine the factors that had caused me to be disabled. No connection was made between the criminal matter and this disability claim. This fact that the matters were unrelated explained why there would be no apologies and no admission that mistakes were made. The fact that I had been suicidal and spent time on a psychiatric ward helped my disability case on the grounds that major depression and generalized anxiety disorder were threatening my ability to survive, but nothing was done to connect the depression and anxiety to the trauma I had experienced. In this twisted reality, truth held no weight. Here, the innocent people were imprisoned while the violent were shielded. I would relay this statement to my therapist over a decade later, finally confronting my seething anger. I never envisioned a future where I'd be branded a criminal, where I'd be labeled as disabled, where I'd be condemned to live shackled by a lie I could never erase. A roof over my head was granted, but I remained ensnared, still haunted by ghosts that would follow me forever, still fettered to a past I never chose or deserved. I was forced to look for and find any way to cope and to live. But despite having a home, despite receiving a monthly check, despite the illusion of stability, the brutal truth persisted. I had already lost everything that ever held meaning, and I had no clue how to reclaim it.